And now we move to Vygotsky. We're going to first talk about his background as always, get into the specifics, and then go to the evaluation. Lev Vygotsky was born in the Russian Empire, present day Belarus to be specific, and he was born to a middle class Jewish family, and his father was a banker. He was precocious. He was supposedly called the Little Professor because he was involved in student discussions so much in school. He even organized debates and mock trials where friends took the role of historical figures like Aristotle and Napoleon, as I'm sure all of you have done. He was admitted to the University of Moscow, where he studied law, but he had many other interests as well, including later writing a dissertation on Hamlet. He later taught psychology at a teacher's college at a small town in western Russia. And following Russia's socialist revolution in 1917, he became part of the Socialist Party. In 1924, he gave a talk at a conference, and the people there were so impressed by him that he was invited to be a research fellow in Moscow, even though he wasn't formally trained in psychology. We have a little bit of Erickson similarity here. He, along with two of his other colleagues, Luria and Leontiev, and please excuse me if I'm not saying the Russian names correctly, they made a new form of psychology largely based on Marxism. And among these people, the lack of formal training that Vygotsky and others had actually wasn't a problem because of their egalitarian tendencies. Some people even argued that the social upheaval allowed Vygotsky to develop his theory and influence psychology so much that without it, that he wouldn't have been who he was. The main idea of the theory was that they wanted to change citizens' thinking from a helpless mentality of servitude towards landlords and instead towards self directed activity and having a commitment to their social group based on sharing, cooperation, mutual support, and the like. And additionally, they wanted to help improve literacy rates among the poor. And his interest in the poor was not just in the non-traditionally schooled, was not just among the poor. He was also interested in the education of those with mental and physical disabilities as well. In the 1930s, he felt the brunt of Stalin. He was accused of being a bourgeois psychologist like Piaget and other Western psychologists. And this was in part because he referenced their work. As a good scholar, he read people from other parts of the world, and it just so happens that Stalin was not a big fan of referencing anybody in the West. He was also criticized because he said that non literate minority people in remote, non industrialized parts of Russia hadn't developed the same intellectual abilities of people in modern areas, which is, I guess at the time, was not something that you said. It might have been thought by some people, but you wouldn't have said that in this group. He died in 1934 due to tuberculosis, and that's at age 37. So he was 37 when he died. His work was banned by the Russian government from 1936 until 1956, but it was still relatively popular, and he was relatively popular even though he was dead. So, what this means is he was only a psychologist and not even a formally trained one for about 10 years, but he still had a huge influence. Some people call him the Mozart of psychology. Mozart died at 35, yet accomplished so much. And he is by far the youngest to die of anyone we will talk about, had the shortest amount of time, but had still a huge, huge influence. And while he died early, his work went on through other Soviet psychologists, and it's probably unfair to them that we look at him so much, but that is how history goes. And he also didn't receive much Western publicity in his time because his works weren't translated into English or other Western languages until the 1960s. So, much like Darwin, he died before knowing anything near what his effect would be. Sociocultural psychologists, and this is what Vygotsky was, sociocultural psychologists focus not on children as the primary unit of analysis like Piaget does, but instead the child participating in a context, in some activity. This is a fundamentally different way of thinking. This is probably the biggest problem that people have in truly understanding Vygotsky, is he said that no one developed in a vacuum, and instead they are inherently social, which means that you can't just study someone. You have to study them in their context and in the activity they are doing. That first bullet point on the slide is very, very important. And context, to Vygotsky, means both the culture they are in and their immediate setting. So it's a broad notion of context. Sociocultural historical context also shapes children's experiences and, he says, defines what they can be. So the culture is influencing the children. But he did say that in return, children affect their cultures, but we'll get to this later. What this does is make us look not to causes internal to children, but instead their environment. So let's say that there's a child who's not doing well in school. Well, why are they not doing well? You could look at them individually and say that, well, that means they don't have some mental ability necessary for something. But if they're abused, if they live in a substandard environment, if they're malnourished, something like that, how are they going to flourish? So to fully understand why people are who they are, you can't just put them or give them a test and see how well they do. Even you all taking this class, those of you who live in an environment where you don't have to work, where you can devote most of your time to your studies, where you have the technology to take an online class, will do probably better than those who do not have the same types of resources. So if someone gets an A in a class, is it because they're brilliant, or is it at least partially because of these outside factors we're talking about? So in this way, children are not one variable aside from their culture. They are essentially fused and function together. So while non-sociocultural psychologists do acknowledge context, they usually look at the child and context as fundamentally different variables. Sociocultural psychologists would say that this is an artificial and distorted way of looking at things. So Piaget might look at someone and give them the pendulum task and see how well they do. And he might say, okay, well, let's also take into account level of education of parents and things like that, and look at them as two different variables. Vygotsky and other socioculturalists would say that this is unwise. That instead, socioculturalists focus on studying children's participation in activities in a culture, meaning that some activity that occurs routinely in everyday life in their culture is what they would be interested in looking at. So you'd want to look at games, working, classroom activities, etc. That you couldn't just get someone's intelligence by giving them a piece of paper and asking them to fill it out, but instead you'd have to get them in a culturally meaningful context and see how well they perform. Socioculturalists also have a slightly different way of thinking about cognition. They look at it as a dynamic process of trying to understand surroundings rather than stored knowledge that's somewhat static. So they look at the process around how people understand things, as opposed to thinking that your mind just is basically a computer that'll spit out information. So they slowly find out how to behave and how to change how they behave in activities. They take more responsibilities at dinner time, for example. So doing things is what creates knowing. So an example of the social nature of the mind can be seen with an example. And please try to follow with me here. I'm going to tell you that there's a mother and a 2-year-old, and I'm going to pretend that I'm both of them. So a mother says, "Did you like the apartment at the beach?" Child says, "Yeah, and I have fun in the water." Mother says, "You had fun in the water?" Child says, "Yeah, I come in the ocean." Mom says, "You went to the ocean?" Child says, "Yeah." "Did you play in the ocean?" And took my sandals off. "You took your sandals off?" And my jammas off. And your jammas off. "And what did you wear to the beach?" "I wear hot cocoa shirt." "Oh, your cocoa shirt." "Yeah." "And your bathing suit?" "Yeah." "And my cocoa shirt." "Yeah." "Did we take a walk to the beach?" "Yeah." So this is child mother going back and forth. The two here are remembering together. The child's mind and memories are dependent on prods from the mother. So the question that a sociocultural psychologist would ask is, where does one stop and the other begin? If we're interested in a child's cognition, what they think, feel, and how they act in the real world, you could ask a child to tell me about the beach that you went to, or tell me about the apartment at the beach. Did you like the apartment at the beach, as the mom started off with? His response was, "Yeah, and I have fun in the water." And there's a real question of, would he have told people, would he have told, if this was a test, would he have told the experimenter or teacher all of the things about what happened without the mother's prodding? You all have probably had times, I can almost guarantee it, where you're trying to tell a story or reflect on something, and you're telling it, and someone else who was there is kind of prodding you or correcting you or something, and that can actually help to unlock parts of your memory that you didn't really have before. Or even try to just look at a yearbook from high school. You'll see people who you haven't thought of it for a long, long time. So you'll have memories from them, but memories that you couldn't have had without this kind of push from, in this case, the book. But in the example that I read to you, the child was remembering things from the mother's prompts. So whose information was it? Whose knowledge, whose memory was this? Well, in this case, the child, again, is not one variable. The child and the mother interacting is what led to this learning. Today, Vygotsky's influence is mainly in cultural psychology. In the past, the field was called cross-cultural psychology, but in that, people viewed culture as one variable simply to be taken into account for. And what they would do is they'd take a task and translate it into a different language and then bring it to a different culture. The difference between that, cross-cultural psychology, and cultural psychology, is that a cultural psychologist would look for a task that makes sense in the culture that it's being studied. And that would allow you to understand the culture on their own terms. So, for example, when communism took over in the Soviet Union, peasants who were working in remote areas began needing to be parts of meetings, planning, etc., and they learned to read and write. And they were also exposed to new ways of thinking, and in particular, more abstract ways that they didn't need to know in everyday life. When they were told all bears in the far north are white, peasants weren't then later able to predict what color bears were in the north. A typical response would be, I don't know what color they are, I haven't seen one. Now, this type of thought to some people looked like it was a lower level version of thought, but within their culture and historical context, there was no reason to be more abstract. In their culture, we'd be stupid because we'd predict things that don't matter. In fact, for everybody listening to this, probably, what advantage do you have, practically speaking, living in Alabama and knowing that polar bears are white? To some people, that would be a waste of time. It doesn't matter what color polar bears are. If they're white, if they're brown, who cares? You're not going to deal with them. So if you don't have the need for this kind of abstract thought, then what's the point? So you couldn't simply translate a task that makes sense in the United States and translate the language into something and take it to somewhere else where it might not mean anything. That's not going to give you the full understanding of the culture. The zone of proximal development is probably the thing that is best known from Vygotsky. The idea of the zone of proximal development is that a more competent person would collaborate with a child to help them move from where they were, or where they are, to where they can be with help. So the definition on the screen, it's the distance between a child's actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving and the higher level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. So someone who can do more comes and helps a child do something. And you see where the child was and then what they could do. And this more capable peer or whoever it is can give prompts and clues, they can model, they can have a discussion, they can encourage the children. So, for an example of this, how many of you have gone to office hours or even been in class and had something make a lot of sense when you're there with a professor? But then you go home and you have a hard time feeling as though you understood it as well. I know I have. So this is the zone of proximal development. You can't do something, but when you are in the presence of someone who is more capable, you then can do it. Then you leave and you can't. So you could do more, you just need some help, need some prompting, or scaffolding. So the hope is that a child or an individual can build competencies they already have and achieve slightly beyond where they previously were. The mother-child memory example from the last slide is actually applicable here. They have a shared experience, and the mother guides the child to explain more, to unlock more knowledge that they had but couldn't independently produce. Another example, in infancy, parents point out things to children in the environment that the children might not see or study or learn on about their own. About on their own. So my wife is an environmental scientist, and when she takes my daughter for walks, she would often stop at different trees and let my daughter, when she was very young, feel the different leaves, touch the trees, touch the bark, all of those kinds of things. That's something I wouldn't have done. It does not occur naturally to me to do that. So in this case, my wife, is helping my daughter learn more about the environment that she wouldn't have been able to do if I was just taking her on a walk or if she was with someone else who didn't do that. It adds a not only knowledge but gives a value to these things in ways that they wouldn't have had otherwise. In these examples, we can see how cultures have their own cultural curriculum, basically skills that are valued by their culture. So if a culture values the knowledge of something, So, which berries are poisonous, where not to go, etc., children will pick up on them. And those things are important. So, in the United States, one of the things that's important for children to learn is how to sit and learn quietly in school. But in places where children are working from an early time, that's probably not something that's as cared about. So, if you were to take a child from a culture where they do not go to formal schooling like we do, and you plop them into one of our classrooms, they might look like the worst behaved child who's ever been in a classroom. But is that the child's fault? Is it that they don't have that ability, or they can't have that ability? Or is it just that the culture has shaped them in certain ways? And a metaphor of scaffolding is often used. So the scaffolding you see on buildings that are being built, it's the part on the outside where people are standing on it, helping create it. For those of you who don't know, so the scaffolding around a building is this temporary framework, just like um, um, just like how more skilled peers, adults, kind of support a child, help them build up on their learning until they're strong enough not to need it. Or also, you could think of it as kind of like training wheels. But children's behaviors also influence adults. Children invite adults to participate in behaviors, they gradually take on more responsibility, and then the adults adjust. So, therefore, it is a collaboration between child and adult, or any two people. Now, while the zone of proximal development is often used in parent child interactions, it can actually be in any situation where a child is learning beyond their current level of functioning. Schooling in general is a really good way you can see it. So, how did Vygotsky do this methodologically? Well, he used dynamic assessment. And that meant that methods must capture the dynamic nature of development and social interaction. He didn't like static assessment. He thought that what children can do with the assistance of others, the zone of proximal development, is actually a better reflection of their intellectual ability than what they can do alone. Because then you could take someone who is not actually able to do something due to their circumstances, if they're abused, neglected, not in a good school, and you could see what they actually could do if they were given opportunities. And I hope in this you can see the profoundly anti-individualistic nature of this. So instead of an individual scoring on a test, it is about what they can do with others. And if you think about it, even in college, if you are collaborating with someone else on a test to see how well you can get thrown out for that. College schooling is profoundly individualistic. Our school system could probably benefit from this. And in the real world, how often are you going to be given a test where you are only able to work on your own? In the real world, in real world jobs, that almost never happens. Everybody here probably hates working in groups and group projects, but that's what the workplace is. So, in an individualistic culture, we value how well one person can do on a test. But in the real world, it's really about how people can interact with other people and achieve. So, dynamic assessment measures children's readiness or potential for learning rather than the products of past learning. And standardized intelligence tests examine past learning, not potential. And this can be assessed in several ways. Adults might provide a single clue and see how a child improves. For example, the second bullet point, NGOHPIQJ. Try to figure this out. In terms of what comes next. Well, if you don't know, then a parent or teacher might say, "Is this a problem you've seen before?" And if they say yes, you might say, "Well, what kinds of problems were it before? Were they?" If they say no, you might say, "Well, what are these things?" They could say letters. At a later point in an assessment, a clue could be point to the N and the O in the alphabet, and to the G and the H. Does that help at all? And then slowly you try to see at what point in time the person can take it on their own and solve it. He also required that participants be viewed at several experimental sessions. And he called this the microgenetic model, where researchers try to see a developmental moment. He would actually set up obstacles that interfered with routine problem-solving procedures, and then he would observe children's attempts to cope with them. Or he would provide tools for children to use and see how different aged children use them. Current sociocultural researchers use observational methods, both for dyads and larger groups. Dyads, just two people, and larger groups. But he was especially concerned, and they are now especially concerned, in natural, taking observation in the natural environment as opposed to the lab. At home, children typically act on objects in a way that's familiar to them, in a setting that is comfortable. And what's more meaningful, them doing that or them doing something in a lab with something new that they're not used to in a way they're not comfortable? You can probably especially see this in children with sensory issues or with social anxiety, where if you bring them to a new place, they're going to have more trouble, not because they're less capable, but instead because they're not comfortable. So they can do more than they might show. Additionally, he would use ethnographies and other methods taken from anthropology. All of these tasks would exceed the child's cognitive level, so they would be constructing new skills when they did this. That was his big key, seeing where they are at and where they can go. So the mechanism of development here. His focus is on change and mechanisms more than performance and outcomes. He's not as concerned with how well people did, but instead how they got there. And he said that development is this process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This is the idea or the phenomenon, the opposing idea and phenomenon, and the resolution. And he said that this would produce a higher level concept or more advanced functioning. So, for example, a child acting by themselves, then a child acting with the help of an adult, and the two of those times come together to form a new and higher level of thinking. Vygotsky was more interested in settings with a child and a more skilled person, and typically an adult, because he was focused on formal instruction. However, currently people are looking to interactions with people who have comparable skill levels. So people would co-construct knowledge. And the novel outcome is not clearly one child's or the other's. It's a combination then. So if you had two kids and you gave them a bunch of Legos and asked them to make something, what they would make together, assuming they do work together, would be different than one of them by themselves. So thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is the idea or phenomenon, the opposing idea or phenomenon, and the resolution. So let's talk about the four developmental issues now. First, on human nature. He was a contextualist. He said that you can only understand individuals in their cultural context. And honestly, if he were to hear me say an individual, you can understand an individual, he'd say, no, you can't. There is no individual. Humans are not independent entities that engage in their environment. Instead, they are part of the environment. Is development quantitative or qualitative? Well, it's both. In a dialectical process, things can develop in a quantitative way, but the synthesis can result in qualitative changes. Things like inner speech, moving from spontaneous to scientific thought, concrete to abstract thought. All of these things have both. Um, and there is no, you'll notice, we don't have a stage theory here. And it's not that he was opposed to stages, it's just the sociocultural psychologists typically don't think in those ways. Nature and nurture. Nature and nurture to him are both intertwined. Vygotsky said that biology and culture are kind of commingling with one another, and that, quote, the two lines of change interpenetrate one another and essentially form a single line of sociobiology formation of the child's personality. So it's not how much does culture influence development so much as it is how do biology and culture work together to construct development. And while he did acknowledge these biological forces, the emphasis was certainly on culture. And then finally, what develops? Well, this is very broad. It's the broadest of all of them we've looked at. It could be cultural historical change, or it could be microgenetic changes from moment to moment in an individual child. But he did say that an active child in cultural context was the smallest unit that develops. But additionally, there's a variety of cognitive skills that develop. Most importantly, a system of meaning and psychological tools in a culturally constructed system of knowledge. So development has no endpoint to him. So let's evaluate this. There are some strengths. The attention to sociocultural context was a big, big strength. He was unique in development in looking at history, sociology, economics, and other areas to inform his theory. He was also unique in the different perspective on learning and on developmental changes in that. He also looked at attachment as necessary for social trust and to fit with infants and activities with other areas of social activity. But most importantly today for us is his look at the boundary between the self and others. And this is what I really think we could learn from best, was that the line between where any one person starts and another person or stops and another person begins can be very difficult to draw, especially in the workplace. I mean, that's why when you can have so many problems in work when one person takes credit for an idea. Should you get credit for an idea if you are there spitballing with someone and then somebody comes up with the key, the kind of eureka moment? If they have a eureka moment, but it's brought to the fore by your conversation with them? His integration of learning and development was big as well. Vygotsky was very big into learning, and he said that learning drives development, as we've said. And as children learn, they reach a higher level of development. Now, this doesn't sound particularly special, but when you add in the zone of proximal development, this suddenly becomes very important for child rearing, culture, and education. And in fact, of all the people we're going to talk about, if you were in the education department, you would maybe not know that you're learning Vygotsky, but of anyone we talk about, it definitely, Vygotsky would be the one that you would hear most echoes of. And then the final strength, sensitivity to the diversity of development. Most developmental theories focus on universals. We've talked about that with the stages for the first three people we've talked about. But Vygotsky and other socioculturalists acknowledge individual differences and differences in cultures in a unique way. It's important for us as scientists to understand that most research comes from the United States or middle-class Western children. That's a fact. So universals in these samples might be different than for others. And some cultural psychologists question if there are universals in anything. Now, I don't agree with this. I think that people are largely people, and biologically, we are all so incredibly similar that many, many things are going to be the same. We're going to talk about this later in the semester. But it certainly makes sense to say that there could be differences cross culturally. And the weaknesses. First one is the vagueness of the zone of proximal development. There are two main ambiguities here. Now, the first one is knowing the width of the zone, basically how far people can go from where they are to what they could do, doesn't provide a complete picture of children's learning, their style of learning, or their current level of development, especially relative to other children of the same age. So it's just kind of incomplete. It's nice to know, but what does it really tell us? And then the second issue with the zone of proximal development is that there's no metric to determine the distance of an area of proximal development. There's no common scales. So if you are learning how to ride a bike and someone helps you and you go from not being able to ride a bike at all, you fall over, and then you go to being able to ride for 3 seconds, how does that compare to a zone of proximal development for learning math multiplication tables? Well, we just don't have a common scale there. And there are some other issues there as well. What are the psychological processes involved in internalization? And most of the information we have is from mother-child dyads or peer dyads, but to a lesser extent. And then the final weakness, there are difficulties with the cultural historical accounts. Few studies examine or are even able to examine social context, historical social context. It's practically very difficult to do cultural research, cross-cultural research. It's expensive, and so it's very expensive to do it for social and cross-cultural research, but it's impossible to do it for historical research. There's no way we can go back in time and give people psychometrically valid scales and then compare how they did compared to people later. So this is a problem for us when we do take this into account. Now, we can look at it theoretically, we can do our best to understand, but there's no real good way that we can do that. But in all, Vygotsky is probably my favorite person to talk about because I think that we are so individualistic, and especially in the area he was most interested in education. The fact that you guys are taking these classes online and you are possibly not going to even see anybody else in the class is something that would probably trouble him greatly, because in the real world we have in a real job situation or family situations, you're around other people, you are integrating with them in profound ways. And it's very difficult for us to fully appreciate that because the measurement of all of this is so difficult. And his notion of a child or an individual person's knowledge being dependent upon other people, I think is so true, but it's something that we miss oftentimes. So, in general, Vygotsky, not the most long-term psychologist, but very, very important contributions to developmental psychology and psychology in general.